The first night I heard the screaming beneath the ice, I almost broke and ran, but running is the one thing you're never supposed to do out here. I was hired to guard an isolated diamond mine in the middle of Siberia, a place so far from civilization that the snow seems to swallow sound and time itself. They told me there were 9 strange rules I had to follow if I wanted to survive, and at first I thought it was some twisted initiation joke, but then I remember the first time I broke one of the rules, and what clawed its way out of the frozen shaft to remind me. Some of the rules are simple, some are impossible, and all of them are deadly. The real question is, who wrote them in the first place, and why do they know what's coming? When I first arrived at the Siberian diamond mine, the world felt like it had been abandoned. The outpost was nothing more than a squat concrete building, pressed against an endless wall of snow, with the mine's black mouth gaping only a few hundred meters away. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that made every breath sting your lungs, and the silence was so absolute it felt unnatural. Oleg, the head of security, met me at the gate and pressed a folded sheet of paper into my hand. "Read these, memorize them," he said, his voice as flat as the ice. At the top of the list was Rule 1, never descend into the mine after sundown. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I had guarded warehouses, docks, even a prison once, and rules were always there to cover liability, not reality. Mines collapse, shafts flood, gases build up. I assumed this was just another safety measure, dressed in superstition. When I asked Oleg why sundown mattered, he looked at me with an expression I still can't forget. His eyes weren't angry, but heavy, like he carried knowledge I wasn't ready for. "Because that's when they wake up," he muttered, and walked away before I could ask who they were. That first night, I lay in my bunk listening to the wind battering the walls. The generator hummed weakly, but beyond that, there was nothing. No cars, no animals, no voices. I thought I heard a sound once, something slow and deliberate, like pacing just outside the window. When I sat up, flashlight trembling in my hand, the noise stopped. I told myself it was just the beams creaking from the cold, but when I closed my eyes again, I dreamed of the mine yawning open, something moving inside where the light couldn't reach. I woke in a sweat, the words of Rule 1 echoing like a warning in my skull. By daylight, the mine didn't seem threatening. The entrance was fortified with steel beams, and the main shaft spiraled deep into the earth. My flashlight caught on graffiti, carved into the walls in languages I didn't recognize. Crude drawings, strange symbols, faces with mouths open wide. A crew of miners still worked the site, grizzled men who avoided small talk, their faces weathered by isolation. When I asked them about Rule 1, they avoided my eyes, muttering under their breath. Only one, a cocky young worker named Ilya, smirked and said, "It's just to scare new guards. Nothing down there except old rock and rust." The way the older men glared at him made me uneasy. 3 nights later, I learned the truth. I was stationed near the shaft when Ilya appeared with a grin, tugging on his helmet. "Come on," he whispered. "Let's see how real this rule is." I tried to stop him, reminding him of Rule 1, but he only laughed. "What are you afraid of, guard dog? Shadows." Against my better judgment, I followed, my flashlight beam trembling as we stepped deeper into the shaft. The cold grew heavier with each step, and the silence pressed down until I could hear nothing but the crunch of our boots. We had gone maybe 20 minutes when it began. A faint scraping sound rose from below, steady and deliberate, like claws dragging across stone. I froze, my heart hammering, but Ilya rolled his eyes. "Probably just ice shifting," he muttered. Then came a second sound, softer but sharper, a moan. It wasn't human. The sound vibrated through the walls, so low I felt it in my chest, and before I could speak, another voice joined it, higher, rasping, almost like a child's cry. They overlapped in a grotesque harmony, echoing up the shaft. My skin went cold with fear. "We need to go," I hissed, pulling at Ilya's arm, but he hesitated, listening. Then something answered, not a moan this time, but a shrill cry that pierced through the dark, closer than it should have been. Ilya's grin vanished. We ran, boots slamming against stone, flashlights bouncing wildly as the voices rose behind us. They weren't following with footsteps, but the air shifted, a rush of hot breath pushing against our necks. I didn't dare look back, but I felt something moving in the shadows, keeping pace just beyond the light. My lungs burned as we sprinted for the surface, every second stretching into forever. When the entrance finally came into view, a rush of relief nearly buckled my knees, but just as we burst into the open air, I felt it, a searing gust across the back of my neck, rancid and wrong. We collapsed outside, gasping, and as soon as we crossed the threshold, the voices cut off. Silence swallowed everything, almost mocking. Oleg was waiting, his face carved in stone. He didn't shout, didn't ask questions. He only looked at Ilya with an expression of pity and said, "You broke Rule 1. His voice was soft, almost mournful, and that frightened me more than anger ever could. The next morning, Ilya was gone. His bunk was stripped bare, his helmet missing, and no one claimed to see him leave. No tracks in the snow, no footprints leading away from camp. It was as if the mine had claimed him in the night. I asked Oleg if we should search, but he only shook his head. The mine doesn't give back what it takes." His words left me hollow, but worse was the memory of that hot breath against my neck. Ilya had escaped the shaft, but something had followed him, and maybe it still had him even now. That night, I took my watch alone. I kept the floodlights fixed on the entrance, refusing to look away even as the hours dragged by. For a moment I thought I saw something at the edge of the light, a shape too tall, too thin, standing unnaturally still. My heart thundered as I blinked, and it was gone, leaving nothing but darkness. But the silence felt alive, as if the mine itself was holding its breath. I gripped my rifle tighter, whispering Rule 1 over and over in my head, reminding myself that as long as I stayed out, I was safe. At least, I hoped so. The following nights were worse. At sunset, faint whispers began to drift from the shaft. Sometimes they sounded like children, sometimes like old men, but always too soft to understand. The miners ignored it, drowning the noise with vodka or the crackle of the radio, but I couldn't. I caught myself leaning closer, straining to catch the words. Oleg noticed and warned me sharply. "Don't listen. They want you to step inside. That's how it starts." His warning clung to me, like frost, but the temptation only grew stronger. What if they were calling for help? What if Ilya was still down there? One night, I asked Oleg outright, "What's in the mine?" He stared into his cup of tea for a long time before answering. "Not what, who. They've been here longer than us. The rules aren't to keep them out, they're to keep us from letting them in." His voice shook just enough to convince me he believed it. That was the moment I understood the rules weren't superstition. They were a fragile barrier, and Ilya had cracked it. A week later, I woke in the middle of the night to find the room colder than usual, my breath fogging the air. At first I thought the generator had failed, but then I saw frost stretching across the floor, inching beneath my door. It crept slowly, deliberately, as if it was alive. My flashlight beam froze it in place, the ice glimmering like veins. I sat rigid, gripping the light, until dawn. That night, I knew the truth. The mine wasn't contained by stone and steel. It was reaching, waiting for me to fail. And the worst part was the whisper I swore I heard, just as the frost stopped moving. My own name, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. After the night I saw frost creep across my floor, I understood something that Ilya hadn't. The rules weren't warnings to scare me. They were shields. Thin ones, but shields nonetheless. I repeated Rule 1 in my head, like a mantra as the sun rose, and Oleg's words about keeping them in echoed until they almost drowned out my own thoughts. But when I checked the rule sheet again that morning, one line leapt at me more than the rest. Just beneath the first, bold and unyielding, was Rule 2. Always seal the bunker door before midnight. I stared at it longer than I wanted to, wondering what could possibly happen if I forgot. The bunker was the main living quarters, a squat concrete shelter buried partly underground, with a thick metal door that hissed when shut. At first, I assumed it was about keeping out the cold. Midnight in Siberia could freeze your lungs solid, and if the generator failed, the wind alone might kill us. But Oleg made it clear that sealing the door wasn't just about temperature. "Midnight is when the snow moves," he said one evening. His eyes locked on the dark horizon. "You don't want to see what walks with it." He didn't elaborate, and none of the other miners would meet my eyes. I tested the door during the day, cranking the wheel to feel how heavy it was. Once sealed, it was airtight, locking us inside with only a small vent for circulation. Part of me hated the thought of being trapped like that, cut off from the outside. But that night, as the clock inched toward midnight, I realized it wasn't a choice. We sealed the door together, the sound echoing like a coffin closing, and only then, with everyone inside, did Oleg relax his shoulders, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled more than usual. It wasn't until the third night that I understood why. I had been restless, pacing the narrow hall of the bunker as the others slept. Midnight came and went, the door sealed, and the air thick with recycled breath. Then I heard it, a crunching sound outside, heavy and deliberate, moving across the snow in slow, dragging steps. My pulse hammered as I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. Whatever it was circling us. The sound stopped just outside the bunker, and for one agonizing moment, the silence was total. Then came the sound of scraping, not on the ground, but on the metal door itself. I stumbled back, heart in my throat. The scraping was slow, almost curious, like claws tracing the shape of the steel. I thought about the frost that had crept beneath my door days earlier, about the voices in the mine, and my skin prickled with terror. The scraping lasted only a minute, but it felt like an eternity before it stopped. The footsteps receded into the night, leaving me shaking, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep at all until the first weak light of dawn slipped through the vent. And when I told Oleg, he only nodded. "That's why you follow Rule 2. A week later, one of the miners almost broke it. His name was Anton, a broad-shouldered man who laughed too loud and drank too much. That night, he was late returning from the outpost shed, stumbling through the snow with a bottle in hand. The clock was minutes from midnight when Oleg shouted for him to hurry. We sealed the door just as Anton stumbled inside, the wheel locking into place with a groan. He grinned drunkenly and raised the bottle. "See? Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the image of how close he had been, how easily the door could have stayed open a moment too long. That night, the noises were worse. It wasn't just scraping or footsteps. It was breathing, deep, guttural, like lungs too large for any living creature, pressed against the walls of the bunker. The sound rattled through the steel, each inhale shaking the air vents, each exhale steaming the cold air that slipped inside. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. I could feel it in my bones. Oleg barked at everyone to stay silent, not to answer, not to move. And when Anton swayed unsteadily, muttering a slurred curse, Oleg nearly knocked him unconscious just to shut him up. The thing outside circled us for hours. Sometimes it sounded distant, wandering through the snow, and then suddenly close, dragging its breath across the very door we had sealed. My throat ached from holding back my own breathing, terrified it would hear me. When dawn finally broke, and the first light touched the snow, the noise stopped instantly, as though it had never been there at all. We unsealed the door in silence, and outside, the snow was marked with tracks. Not boot prints, not animal paws, long, uneven trenches, like something had dragged itself through the drifts on limbs too twisted to walk. From that day forward, no one joked about Rule 2. Anton sobered quickly, though his eyes stayed hollow. He muttered that he had felt something watching him on the way back that night, something that followed him just out of sight. It was waiting, he whispered, for the door not to close. Oleg didn't deny it. He only told us that if the door was ever left unsealed, none of us would survive until dawn. I wanted to ask how he knew, but I was too afraid of the answer. The nights that followed became a ritual. At 11:45, no matter what we were doing, we dropped everything to check the bunker door. We tightened the wheel until our arms ached, making sure every seal was closed, and then we waited, listening to the night for the sounds of the snow moving. Some nights were quiet, others filled with faint dragging noises that grew closer and closer until they pressed against the walls. But the worst part wasn't the sounds. It was the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't trying to get in. It was waiting for us to let it in. One night, I made the mistake of peering through the tiny slit of the air vent, curious against my better judgment. At first, all I saw was snow shifting in the weak moonlight. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light, tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs hanging too long at its sides. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there staring at the bunker. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and swore never to look again. The next morning, when we unsealed the door, the snow at the edge of the vent was melted, as though something had pressed its face there, breathing against the steel. Now every night, I count the minutes until the clock strikes midnight. I hear the dragging steps outside, the slow, deliberate breathing, and sometimes the faint scrape of claws on metal. I remind myself over and over of Rule 2, always seal the bunker door before midnight. Because I know if I ever forget, if the door ever stays open, even for a moment past midnight, whatever walks with the snow will finally step inside, and deep down, I think it's only waiting for one of us to slip. By the time I had memorized Rule 1 and Rule 2, I thought I understood the rhythm of survival at the mine. Seal the door before midnight. Never step into the shaft after sundown. And maybe you'd live long enough to see the spring thaw. But as the days blurred into nights, a new problem began to surface, one I hadn't been warned about until I looked closer at the crumpled sheet of rules. Just beneath the reminder about the bunker door was the line that made my stomach twist. Rule 3, never respond to voices calling your name. It sounded ridiculous at first. Who would be out here to call me? The outpost was isolated. The miners rarely spoke more than a word or two, and the nearest village was days away by Snowcat. But Oleg noticed me reading it over at dinner one night, and muttered, "That one's the hardest to follow." His tone made it clear that he wasn't joking. I didn't press him for details. Something about the way his hands shook as he lifted his cup told me the explanation would be worse than ignorance. The first time I heard it was 3 nights later. I was on watch outside, standing near the floodlights that bathed the mine entrance in harsh yellow. The snow stretched endless and empty, the wind tugging at my coat. That's when I heard it, faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind. A voice calling my name. My first instinct was to believe one of the miners had wandered too far from the bunker. I turned, scanning the perimeter, but the snow was untouched. The voice came again, clearer this time, drawn out as if savoring each syllable. "Daniel," my chest tightened. No one here called me by my first name. I gripped my rifle, heart racing, and fought the instinct to answer. Every muscle in my body screamed to shout back, to demand who it was. But the words of Rule 3 clamped down on my tongue like iron. Never respond. The voice drifted closer, now just beyond the ring of light, soft and coaxing. "Daniel, help me." It sounded like Ilya. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen him since the night he broke Rule 1, and part of me wanted desperately to believe he was alive, trapped out there. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't him. I forced myself to retreat into the bunker, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely spin the wheel to seal it. The miners glanced at me, but said nothing. Oleg only gave me a long, heavy look, and nodded once, as if to say he knew exactly what I had heard. I lay awake that night, the voice echoing in my head, each syllable stretching like claws around my skull. It hadn't stopped when I left the watch, It had followed me inside, whispering just beyond the edge of sleep. The next morning, Anton looked worse than usual, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. Over breakfast he muttered, "They called me too." He said he had heard his wife's voice outside, pleading with him to come home. "She said my name like she always did," he whispered, his hands shaking around the tin cup. She sounded so real. Oleg slammed his fist on the table, silencing him. "Don't speak of it. Don't give it power." But the damage was already done. Anton looked broken, like something had crawled inside him during the night and hollowed him out. That evening, the voices came again. This time I was lying in my bunk when I heard my mother's voice drifting through the vents. Soft, warm, exactly as I remembered from childhood. "Daniel, it's me. Open the door." For a split second, I almost did. My hand reached for the wheel before I caught myself, heart slamming against my ribs. She'd been dead for years. There was no way it could be her. The realization turned my blood cold, and I sat in silence, gripping my blanket as the voice repeated itself again and again. Each time weaker, sadder, like it was fading. The guilt nearly crushed me. By the fourth night, the voices changed. They weren't familiar anymore. They were strangers. Old men, children, women I'd never known. They whispered my name from every direction. Some gentle, some mocking. Sometimes they laughed. Other times they begged. I shoved cloth into my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound wasn't only outside. It was inside my skull, like they were speaking directly into my thoughts. I began to understand why Oleg said it was the hardest rule. You can block a door, you can avoid a tunnel, but how do you ignore your own name when it's all you can hear? One night, Anton broke. We woke to the sound of the bunker door, wheel spinning, the metal groaning as he forced it open. Oleg tackled him before it unsealed, his roar echoing through the hall. "Do you want to kill us all?" he shouted, slamming Anton against the wall. Anton sobbed, screaming that his wife was outside, that she was freezing and needed him. "She was crying for me," he wailed. But the rest of us knew the truth. It wasn't her. It never was. After that, Oleg chained the bunker door at night, not trusting even his own men. He assigned me the task of holding the key, telling me in a voice that brooked no argument, "If anyone tries to answer, stop them, even if it means putting them down." His eyes were bloodshot, heavy with exhaustion, but his resolve was unshakable. I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought. The rules weren't only about survival anymore. They were about trust, about keeping each other from making fatal mistakes. The worst came a week later. I was standing near the vent when I heard the voice again. Not soft, not coaxing, but angry. My own voice, shouting my name, demanding that I open the door. It was like hearing an echo twisted into something cruel, and the sound rooted me to the floor. "Daniel," it snarled, "you don't belong here. Open it." My legs nearly gave out. I bit down so hard on my tongue that I tasted blood, forcing myself to stay silent. If I answered, even in rage, I knew I'd be lost. That night, I realized Rule 3, never respond to voices calling your name, wasn't just about survival, it was about sanity. The voices weren't random, they were learning, adapting, finding the cracks in each of us. And if they ever found the right voice, the one you couldn't ignore, you'd open the door yourself. And I knew then that they were getting closer to mine. After weeks in the mine, I realized that every rule wasn't just about keeping something out. It was about keeping something hidden. The list didn't explain what, but the patterns were obvious. The sealed bunker door kept the night at bay. The silence toward the voices kept them from crawling into our minds. And then there was Rule 4, keep the floodlights burning from dusk till dawn. It looked simple, almost mechanical, but the miners treated that line with more fear than the others. They checked the generators twice each afternoon, and when the sun dipped below the horizon, Oleg personally walked the perimeter to ensure not a single bulb flickered. The lights were brutal, harsh, buzzing against the silence of the tundra. They created an artificial daylight around the mine entrance, painting everything beyond in deeper shadow. At first, I thought it was only for safety, protection against wolves or bears wandering too close. But one evening, when a bulb near the southern tower sputtered and died, I saw the truth. It started with a shape, just outside the light's reach, shifting against the snow, not moving like an animal, not walking like a man. It seemed to ripple, like smoke trapped in a body. And the moment the light failed, that shape leaned forward, as though testing the border between their world and ours. I shouted for Oleg, pointing at the darkened tower. He cursed and sprinted to the generator shed, barking orders at Anton to fetch a spare bulb. The other miners froze, watching the darkness, their faces pale. That was when I understood. The floodlights weren't for us to see. They were to keep them from stepping closer. My skin crawled as I stood with my rifle aimed at the edge of the dark, praying Anton would fix the tower in time. When the bulb finally flared back to life, the shadow melted away as though it had never existed. But I knew it had been waiting. That night, Oleg pulled me aside. "You see it now," he said, his voice hoarse. "That's why we never let the lights die. If one goes out, even for a minute, they test the boundary. If all of them went dark, he didn't finish. He didn't have to." I didn't sleep at all, lying awake with the harsh glow seeping through the cracks of the bunker shutters. It was ugly, blinding, unnatural, but without it, we were dead. The true test of Rule 4 came during a storm. The winds rose so strong that the towers swayed, cables groaning, snow flying sideways in blinding sheets. I was on generator duty with Anton, huddled in the shed as the walls rattled. Suddenly, one of the main breakers tripped, plunging half the perimeter into darkness. Through the roar of the wind, I swore I heard movement in the snow, quick, deliberate, circling. Anton's eyes widened, and without a word, we both leapt to reset the breaker. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the wrench. The moment power surged back, I caught sight of a figure pressed against the shed window, its face too long, eyes glowing faintly. It vanished in the flood of light, but the image burned into my mind. That close call broke Anton. He started carrying matches and lantern oil in his pockets, muttering that if the lights failed again, he'd light every wall of the bunker on fire if he had to. Oleg didn't even reprimand him. He just said, "Whatever it takes, just don't let the dark win." It was the only time I saw fear in his eyes, real, bone-deep fear. But one man didn't believe. Petrov, the youngest of the crew, had always scoffed at the rules, muttering that Oleg used them to keep us scared and obedient. One night, drunk on the last of his hidden vodka stash, he decided to prove the rules were nonsense. Before anyone could stop him, he marched to the southern tower and smashed a bulb with a pipe. "See?" he shouted, arms raised, laughing. "Nothing happens." For a moment he was right. The dark beyond the fence was silent. Still, then something moved. It was fast, too fast for the human eye to follow. A streak of blackness that slid across the snow like spilled ink. Petrov barely had time to scream before it yanked him off his feet and dragged him into the dark. His body was gone in seconds, swallowed as if the snow itself had opened to devour him. All that remained was the echo of his scream, carried on the wind long after he was gone. The rest of us stood frozen, staring at the broken bulb still swinging in its socket. We replaced the light, our hands trembling, no one speaking. The silence was heavier than the storm. That night, Oleg gathered us in the bunker and hammered Petrov's fate into our heads. "The lights are life," he growled. "Forget any of the rules, but not this one, never this one. Keep the floodlights burning from dusk till dawn." His voice broke on the last words, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't only commanding us, he was begging. After Petrov, none of us questioned the rule again. We checked the bulbs obsessively, tested the fuel, doubled the wiring. But deep down, we knew it wasn't enough. The lights worked as long as they held, but the shadows were patient. They could wait for storms, for mistakes, for one man too tired to notice a flicker. And when they found that moment, they would slip through the gap like water through a crack in ice. On the coldest night yet, I awoke to the floodlights outside my window flickering, their hum stuttering as the generator strained. The shadows beyond pressed closer, their shapes clear even through the swirling snow. One figure, tall and jagged, stood just beyond the dying beam, its face bent toward the glass. The bulb buzzed once, then twice. I leapt from my bunk, sprinting for the shed with the spare fuel can in my arms, every step echoing with the knowledge that if the light died for even a breath longer, I'd never make it back alive. When I slammed the shed door shut behind me, my hands numb from the fuel can, Anton was already bent over the generator. He had stripped his gloves, his bare fingers raw and bleeding from frostbite, but he didn't care. The floodlights outside flickered like dying stars, and in that half-dark, I thought I saw the outline of a figure pressed against the outer wall of the shed, listening. We poured the fuel together, and with a deafening cough, the generator roared back to life. The lights flared, burning white across the snow, and the shadow was gone. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, but Oleg only muttered, "We almost lost everything. You think the lights are bad? You don't want to find out what they call." The next morning, he introduced us to Rule 5, never let the radio go silent. It sounded ridiculous compared to the others. The old shortwave radio sat in the corner of the bunker, crackling with static, its wires patched with tape, its dials temperamental. Oleg explained it like scripture. "The static keeps them confused," he said, "keeps their voices from coming through. If the radio dies, they'll whisper instead. And once you hear them clear, you'll follow." His eyes lingered on me, as if he expected me to laugh like Petrov once had. But after what I'd seen at the floodlights, I didn't laugh. I learned quickly why the miners kept the radio alive. During the night, when the wind stilled and silence settled over the tundra, the static filled the air like a barrier. It hissed and popped, comforting in its ugliness. But when the static dipped, even for a second, other sounds slipped through. Once, as I sat my shift, I heard a woman's voice. It was faint, buried in the crackle, but I knew my mother's accent instantly. "Come home," it whispered. "It's safe now." My chest tightened, and for a terrifying second, I almost reached for the dial. But then Oleg's hand clamped down on my shoulder, his eyes hard. "That's not her," he growled. "That's them." Anton wasn't so lucky. He was already fraying after Petrov's death, barely sleeping, clutching his lantern oil like a talisman. One night, when I woke to take over his shift, I found him hunched over the radio, tears streaking his dirty face. Through the static, I heard a voice, his daughter's, soft and sweet, calling his name. "Papa, please, I'm cold. Come outside, just a minute." Anton's trembling hand hovered over the switch, desperate to silence the static and hear her clearly. I slapped it away before he could. He turned on me, eyes wild, shouting that I didn't understand. Oleg dragged him back, pinning him until the voice faded into nothing but white noise. For hours afterward, Anton sat staring at the floor, whispering apologies to no one. The danger wasn't only temptation. Sometimes the static changed. One night it slowed, deepening, each crackle stretching into a low growl. I leaned closer, and beneath it came a chorus of whispers, not one voice but dozens, all overlapping. "We see you," they hissed. "We wait." My stomach knotted, and I reached for the dial to increase the volume, thinking it might drown them out. But the more I turned it, the clearer they became. It took Oleg smashing the dial back to its original position before the voices blurred again. "Never touch the frequency," he snapped. "That's what they want. They pull you closer one click at a time." His voice broke slightly as he added, "That's how we lost Mikhail." I didn't ask about Mikhail then, but later I saw his name carved into the radio's wooden frame. Beneath it, in shaky Cyrillic letters, were the words "still calling." My skin crawled. Whoever Mikhail had been, he hadn't just died. He was still out there, whispering in the static, waiting for someone to listen. The thought made every shift at the radio feel like sitting guard over a grave that was still speaking. One night, while everyone else slept, the static died. No warning, no slow fade, just silence, sharp and total, heavier than the snow outside. My breath caught. In that stillness, I heard footsteps crunching in the frost beyond the bunker, slow, deliberate. Then a knock at the steel door, followed by a voice that made my blood turn to ice. It was my own. "Let me in," it said, perfect and calm. "They left me outside. Open up." I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The door shuddered as the voice grew louder, angrier, mocking. I said, "Let me in." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, with a sudden crackle, the static roared back to life. The voice cut off mid-word, the door falling still. When Oleg burst into the room, seconds later, I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. He looked at the radio, then at me, and said only, "That's why we never let the radio go silent." His face was pale, and I knew he had heard it too. From then on, I clung to Rule 5 like scripture. I cleaned the contacts, rewired the antenna, and kept a spare battery pack strapped to my back at all times. But no matter how careful we were, the static couldn't cover everything. Sometimes, at the edge of sleep, I still heard the voices slip through. Not strangers, not monsters, but people I loved. My mother, my brother, even myself. They spoke with such familiarity that in the darkest hours, I wondered if the static was keeping them out or keeping me in. That question gnawed at me the night Anton finally broke. I woke to the silence first. Then I saw him, crouched by the radio, the dial turned fully to the right. His face was wet with tears, his eyes shining with something like relief. "I can hear her," he whispered, smiling as though he'd just come home from war. Before I could reach him, he stood, opened the bunker door, and stepped into the blizzard. His silhouette vanished in the dark, swallowed without a sound. The static sputtered, then steadied, but the bunker felt colder, emptier. Later, Oleg didn't rage or curse. He just sat by the radio, staring into the static, as though waiting for Anton's voice to join the others. His hands trembled as he muttered, "Another one gone, and we're still here." That night, as the white noise filled the bunker, I lay awake listening. Beneath the hiss, I swore I heard Anton whisper my name. The morning after Anton walked into the storm, silence sat heavy in the bunker. Nobody spoke his name, though we all listened for it in the static, terrified it would join the others. Oleg scribbled his loss in the logbook with hands that shook, then shut it firmly as if closing a coffin. After that, he didn't eat, didn't sleep, just kept repeating the next rule like a prayer. Rule 6. Never step onto the ice after midnight. He said it as though Anton's death had been inevitable, but breaking this rule would be something worse, something final. At first I thought it was just superstition. The mine sat in permafrost, a frozen lake spanning across its eastern edge. Even in daylight, it was a graveyard of cracks and shadows, the surface shifting with groans that made your teeth ache. But Oleg swore that after midnight, the ice wasn't ice anymore. "It's a mirror," he told me, voice low, "and what looks back isn't you." His face hardened when I smirked at the thought. "You think I'm drunk?" Then ask Petrov why we found his body twice. The words stuck in my throat, and I didn't laugh again. The first time I saw it was by accident. I had drawn the night watch, the lantern casting dull circles of light as I walked the perimeter. The wind dropped suddenly, leaving only the faint hiss of the radio from inside the bunker. That was when I noticed it. The ice glowing faintly under the moonlight, smooth as glass, stretching into darkness. Against my better judgment, I edged closer, my breath clouded, my boots crunching soft on frost. Then I saw myself, not just a reflection, but a perfect duplicate, standing on the underside of the ice, moving a fraction slower than I did, its eyes too wide, its smile stretched unnaturally thin. I froze, terror rooting me in place. My reflection tilted its head, 1 second behind me, lips moving silently before I could catch the words. Then, for the briefest moment, it raised its hand, though I had not moved mine. My chest clenched, and I stumbled back, breaking eye contact. The figure pressed its palm to the ice, and I swear the surface rippled like water. By the time I staggered into the bunker, Oleg was waiting. He didn't need me to explain. His voice was grim as he repeated, "Rule 6. Never step onto the ice after midnight." We all obeyed, but not everyone believed. Sergei, the youngest miner, mocked the rule openly. "Ice is ice," he scoffed one evening. "Oleg sees ghosts and everything. Maybe he's been breathing too much diesel." He grinned at me, as if daring me to agree. But when midnight came, Sergei snuck out, boots crunching toward the frozen lake. I followed, cursing him under my breath, but stopped short of the ice. He stood there, lantern raised, and laughed when he saw his reflection beneath. "See," he shouted, "it's just me." Only it wasn't. The reflection was moving before he did, its grin jagged and wrong. Sergei bent down to touch the surface, and in that instant the thing beneath slammed its hand against the ice, cracking it like glass. The sound echoed like thunder, and Sergei screamed as his reflection dragged him down. I lunged forward, but by the time I reached the shore, the ice had sealed smooth again. Sergei's lantern floated a moment, then winked out, leaving only black water. His reflection still stood there, staring up at me, mouthing something I couldn't hear. We never found his body. Oleg just scratched another name into the logbook, his jaw tight, his hands unsteady. The next day, the ice looked normal again, broken only by fissures that spread like veins across its surface. But at night, I swore I still saw Sergei standing under it, waving at me with that same broken smile. I stopped walking near the lake after that. The thought of seeing myself, or worse, one of them, waiting below the ice, made my skin crawl. The danger grew worse with time. Some nights, I woke to faint tapping sounds under the floorboards, rhythmic and patient. Other times, the ice groaned so loud it rattled the lanterns on their hooks, a low voice carrying in the vibrations. One night, Petrov's name echoed through the steel walls, his voice calling as though from beneath us, asking to be let in. The men shivered, staring at the floor, but no one answered. The only sound after was the slow drip of melting frost, though the temperature hadn't risen. It was near the end of my 4th week when I broke the rule, not willingly, but by mistake. The generator sputtered again, lights flickering as I trudged across the yard to restart it. My watch said 12 past midnight, but exhaustion dulled me, and I didn't think. My boots hit the lake's edge before I realized where I was. The moon reflected off the ice, silver and sharp, and I saw them waiting, rows of figures beneath the frozen surface, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They weren't reflections. Some were miners I knew, others were strangers, and all of them were staring straight at me. I stumbled back, my lantern slipping from my hand, its glow fading as it skidded across the ice. One of the figures bent, picked it up, and raised it high, though my hands were empty. My breath caught in my throat as the rows of faces began to smile in unison, their palms pressing against the underside of the ice. The surface shivered, lines forming like spiderweb cracks. I turned and ran, heart hammering, and didn't stop until I was inside the bunker, slamming the door behind me. When I told Oleg what I'd seen, he only sighed, eyes hollow. "They know you now," he said. "Once you look too long, they remember you." His words left me colder than the Siberian night. That was when I realized the rules weren't just about survival, they were about avoiding recognition. The things out there wanted us, and once they knew our faces, the rules might not be enough to keep them away. That night, as the static filled the air and the generator groaned, I dreamed of the ice again. I stood on its surface, unable to move, while dozens of my own reflections pulled at the cracks from below. Their mouths moved together, whispering in perfect unison. When I woke, my breath hung heavy in the air, and frost had formed on the inside of the bunker's window, shaped into handprints from the outside. The night after the frost formed handprints on the glass, none of us slept. We sat in the bunker, huddled around the lantern, the static from the radio crawling over our nerves. That was when Oleg laid the next rule bare. His voice hollow but firm. Rule 7. Never answer the voice that calls your name. He didn't need to explain why. Every man in that room had already heard it at least once, whispered in the dark, too close to our ears, though no one was there. The first time it happened to me, I thought I was dreaming. My name drifted through the corridor like breath, soft and deliberate, so exact it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the sound, it was the tone, familiar, but hollow, stretched too thin. I tried to ignore it, turning deeper into my bunk, but the voice came again, closer, as though leaning over my shoulder. Usman, it hissed warm against my ear. I froze, biting back a scream, and kept my eyes shut until morning. When I told the others, Petrov only shook his head. "If you answer, it doesn't stop," he muttered, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. "It keeps talking, keeps asking, until you say yes, and once you do, it takes you." He didn't elaborate, but the way he shuddered said enough. Oleg simply repeated the rule, his voice sharp this time. Rule 7. Never answer the voice that calls your name. I understood then that answering wasn't just dangerous. It was final, but not everyone had the strength to resist. One night, we heard Mikhail tossing in his bunk, groaning, as though caught in a fever dream. Then faintly, his name slipped through the air, stretched long and thin. Mikhail. His body stiffened. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, sitting upright. The rest of us stayed silent, our fear suffocating. The voice came again, this time from the far corner of the room, low and urgent. "Mikhail." His head snapped toward it. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The silence after was worse than the voice. Every lamp flickered, shadows stretching against the walls, and then Mikhail's body lurched. His mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was the same hollow tone, calling his name again, this time from inside his chest. The men screamed, dragging him from his bunk, but his body twisted violently, bones popping, as though something else was pulling at him from within. Oleg grabbed a blanket and covered his face, shouting for us not to listen. By morning, the body was gone. Only the blanket remained, frozen stiff, as if it had been soaked and left outside overnight. After that, the voice came more often. Sometimes it called from outside the bunker, soft as the wind, coaxing us to open the door. Other times it echoed through the ventilation shafts, bouncing until it sounded like it came from everywhere at once. The cruelest trick was when it mimicked people we trusted. One night, I heard my mother's voice calling me, sweet and warm like I remembered, drifting up from the shaft. "Usman, come here," it whispered. My chest ached at the sound, and for a moment, I almost forgot where I was. Almost. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself silent, staring at the steel door until the voice faded. But others weren't as strong. Yuri, who had barely spoken since Anton's disappearance, finally broke. He sat by the door one night, tears frozen on his face, whispering yes, over and over again, to someone only he could hear. When we tried to drag him back, his body was weightless, hollow as paper, collapsing in our arms. All that remained of him was his parka, brittle and cold as glass. Oleg wrote his name into the logbook, but his hands shook so badly, the letters bled into each other. The worst came when the voice called me again. I was patrolling alone, lantern dim, when I heard it drifting from the mine shaft. "Usman." The sound echoed upward, almost tender, like someone I once knew. "We need you down here." My throat clenched, my instincts screaming to run, but my legs locked in place. The voice grew firmer, more insistent. Answer me." For one terrifying heartbeat, I opened my mouth. My breath caught on the word. I almost said yes, almost. But then I saw something moving in the shadows of the shaft. A figure, pale and boneless, rising toward me. Its mouth opened, and though it didn't move its lips, my name spilled out again, louder, sharper, forcing its way into my ears. I clamped my hands over my head, backing away blindly, until my spine hit the steel door. My voice scraped raw as I screamed for the others. The figure froze at the threshold of the shaft, its body collapsing inward like smoke pulled through a vent, leaving only silence. That night, Oleg confronted me, fury in his eyes. "You almost answered," he spat. "They're getting stronger because you listen. Every time you hesitate, they learn you." His words cut deep, but worse was the truth in them. My silence was slipping. The voices weren't just calling anymore, they were waiting for me to break, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist. The static on the radio grew louder that week, phrases almost forming in the crackle. Some of the men swore they heard their own names, buried in the noise. I refused to listen, keeping the volume low, but one night I caught my name again, whispered faintly between the bursts of static. It was enough to freeze me in place, dread pooling in my stomach. I switched the radio off, but even in silence, I swear I still heard it. By then the bunker felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed alive, every breath too loud. Sleep was impossible, and when I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of the voice again, whispering from the frozen lake. Only this time, when I turned toward the sound, I saw myself standing on the other side of the ice, lips moving in perfect time, and my reflection was smiling. We thought the voices were the worst of it, but Oleg reminded us there was still more to fear. He wrote the next rule across the logbook in bold strokes, almost carving the paper with the pen. Rule 8. Never leave the lights off for more than 3 minutes. At first it sounded simple. The generators were old but reliable, and we had lanterns stacked in every room. Keeping the mind lit seemed easier than fighting shadows in our own minds. But the truth was that the lights weren't just comfort, they were the only barrier holding something back. The first time the power dipped, I realized how fragile that barrier was. We were in the mess hall when the overhead bulbs flickered, buzzing faintly, then blinked out. The sudden dark was suffocating, like being dropped into a cave. At once every man froze, eyes wide, no one daring to move. Oleg barked at me to check my watch. "Count," he ordered, voice sharp as a knife. I whispered the seconds under my breath, each one stretching longer than the last. The darkness felt thick, alive, brushing against my skin as though it could hear me. By the time I reached 90 seconds, faint shapes were stirring at the edges of the room. Not shadows, not exactly. They moved against the walls like smoke trying to take form. Petrov whimpered, clutching his lantern, but Oleg hissed at him to stay still. 3 minutes, he whispered, not a second more. We waited, trembling, until the emergency generator sputtered to life, and the bulbs blinked back on. The room was empty again, but the smell of damp earth lingered in the air, raw and heavy, as though something had been standing right beside us. From that night, keeping the lights alive became our obsession. We rotated shifts on the generator, filled lanterns daily, checked wiring every hour, but no matter how careful we were, the power found ways to fail. One evening, just as we prepared to sleep, the corridor lamps went out all at once, plunging us into black. Oleg's voice cut through the dark. 3 minutes. Remember, we counted together, our voices shaking, the dark pressing tighter around us. By the time the lights returned, I swore I saw handprints smeared across the ceiling, fading as the brightness spread. The real test came when the storm hit. The wind tore at the outpost, howling through the shafts, and then the main generator failed. Every bulb died, one after another, until only our lanterns remained. The darkness surged in from the corners, thicker than before, humming with a low vibration that rattled the walls. Oleg ordered us to light every lantern, but even their glow seemed too thin, barely pushing the black back. I could feel it breathing, brushing the edge of the flame like fingers searching for a weakness. My watch ticked loud in my hand. 1 minute, 2, then the third. We scrambled for the backup generator, cranking it desperately while shadows bent unnaturally along the walls. Petrov screamed, pointing at the far end of the hall. A figure stood there, tall and twisted, limbs bent at angles too sharp to be human. Its face was nothing but a blur of dark, yet I knew it was watching us. The crank finally caught, the backup humming to life, and the lights surged on. The figure melted instantly, leaving only a streak of frost on the steel wall where it had stood. None of us spoke, but every man knew 3 minutes was not a suggestion. It was the edge of survival. After that, we never let the lanterns dim, but exhaustion worked against us. One night, Yuri dozed during his shift, the flame in his lamp sputtering low. By the time Oleg woke him, the room was already drenched in dark, every corner crawling with shapes. Yuri's scream tore through the bunker as the shadows latched onto him, dragging him upward into the ceiling. When the lights came back, his body was gone, leaving only a single boot lying in the center of the floor, still warm. We buried it outside the mine the next morning, our hands shaking too much to speak the words. The worst part wasn't what we saw in the dark, it was what we heard. In the minutes without light, whispers filled the air, dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in languages none of us knew. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they wept, and sometimes they called our names, in perfect unison, urging us to snuff out the flames. It was enough to break men. Petrov began muttering to himself constantly, clutching his lantern so tightly the glass cracked, terrified it might go out. Oleg slapped him once, hard, shouting that fear was more dangerous than the dark. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. The rule followed us even in our dreams. I woke one night drenched in sweat, convinced the lantern by my bunk had gone out. The room around me was black, thick and suffocating, and in the center of it stood the same figure I'd seen in the hall. Its body leaned forward, slow and deliberate, as if savoring my terror. My breath caught in my chest, unable to scream. Just as it reached for me, the light flickered back to life, and I was alone again. The lantern flame burned steady, but I knew the dream wasn't just a dream. The dark was waiting for a mistake. Now every tick of the watch feels like a countdown. Every flicker of the lamp sends ice into my veins. We've learned to live by light, to cling to it as though it's the only thing keeping us human. But the dark is patient. It waits, pressing at the edges of our world, hungry for the moment we falter. And no matter how hard we fight it, one thought lingers in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. One day, the lights will go out for good. By the time we reached the last entry in the logbook, our nerves were frayed like brittle wire. Sleep was rare, food tasted like ash, and even the light no longer brought us comfort, only survival. Oleg gathered us one evening, his voice low, and pointed to the final scrawled command in the tattered pages. Rule 9. If you hear knocking from below, never answer it. We stared at the words, confused, until Petrov muttered that the mine stretched for miles underground, into places no man had ever mapped. If something was knocking from beneath all that frozen earth, then it wasn't human. The first time it happened, we were huddled in the mess hall during another storm. At first I thought it was just the wind shaking the steel plates, but the sound came again. 3 sharp knocks, steady and deliberate, echoing up through the floor beneath our boots. Every man froze. Petrov covered his ears. Oleg's face went pale, and I felt my chest tighten like something was squeezing the air out of me. The knocks came again, closer this time, like a hand rapping on a door. My instincts screamed to answer, to call out into the dark shaft below, but Oleg shouted at us to stay silent. The knocks never stopped that night. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always patient. They followed us from room to room, moving beneath the floors like something stalking us from below. When I pressed my ear against the ground, I swore I heard breathing, ragged, hollow, far too deep to be natural. Oleg yanked me back, slapping me across the face, snarling that listening too closely was as dangerous as responding. He said the men before us had tried, they had knocked back, and none of them had lasted the week. On the third night, Yuri broke. The knocks had grown louder, echoing through the vents and shafts, until sleep was impossible. He staggered out of his bunk, eyes wild, and stomped his boot against the metal floor. "What do you want?" he screamed into the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the floor answered him. A thunderous series of knocks, so violent the walls rattled, and dust fell from the ceiling. Yuri stumbled back, trembling, but it was too late. The answering knocks followed him like footsteps wherever he went, until finally, during the next blackout, he vanished. All that remained was his empty bed, sheets still warm. We tried to drown out the noise with machines, generators, even music blasted from an old radio, but the knocking always cut through. It grew clever, mimicking our rhythms, tapping our names in code across the steel. Sometimes it came in patterns, almost like it was teaching us a language, begging us to join. Petrov swore it called his dead wife's name, tapping it out again and again, until he covered his ears and wept. Oleg said that's how it tricked you, by knowing what voice you longed to hear most. One night, the knocking grew so violent, the bunkhouse floor split. A hairline crack ran across the steel, glowing faintly with frost, and from it leaked a sound that made my blood run cold. A chorus of voices, all whispering at once, layered with hunger and grief. "Let us in," they moaned. "We are waiting." My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat, but Oleg dragged us away, ordering us not to answer, not even to acknowledge it. Still, the temptation clawed at me, the desperate urge to scream back into that void, to demand what they wanted, why they haunted us. The longer we ignored it, the bolder it became. The knocks came from the walls, the ceilings, sometimes even the steel doors themselves. During one shift, I swear I saw the door handle rattle, the metal bending as though something on the other side was trying to come through. My hand twitched toward it before I remembered Rule 9. If you hear knocking from below, never answer it. The urge was almost overwhelming, like something pulling at my mind, whispering that all I had to do was open the door, just once, to be free of the waiting. Petrov didn't last. He cracked under the pressure, whispering to himself, knocking back softly at first, then louder, pounding the steel floor with both fists. Oleg and I tried to drag him away, but his eyes rolled back as though he wasn't himself anymore, his body moving with someone else's will. The floor split wider, a burst of freezing air blasting upward, and then he was gone, swallowed whole by the darkness beneath the crack, his screams echoing until they faded into silence. The fissure sealed shut again, leaving no trace of him but his scarf tangled on the floor. That was the moment I understood. The knocking wasn't just sound, it was a lure, a promise, a hand reaching from below to drag us into whatever hell waited in the frozen depths. And it was patient. It would keep knocking until we gave in, one by one. Now I hear it every night, slow, steady, always there beneath my bunk. Sometimes I swear I hear my own voice knocking back, as though another version of me is trapped down there, begging me to open the way. I grip the lantern until my knuckles go white, whispering Oleg's words in my head, "Do not answer." But I don't know how much longer I can resist. The rules have kept me alive, but they've also driven me to the edge of madness, and with every passing night, the knocks grow louder. Sooner or later, I think one of us will answer. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.